My parents drained the education fund I built up by working since I was 13 to cover my sister's cosmetic surgeries. Apparently, she needed them to glow up after her second divorce at 25. I told them, fine, do whatever you want, and then exposed all their dirty secrets to my grandparents. Now, they're furious because my sister can't play the victim anymore. This is how they decided to use her portion of a $300,000 inheritance. I'm an 18-year-old guy from a bizarrely patriarchal family. Honestly, they're more toxic than traditional because, despite being a son, I've always been treated like an outsider, while my 25-year-old sister, Grace, has been showered with love and favoritism simply because she's the eldest and a girl. I can't stand her, and she has zero interest in me. That's just how it has always been, and I've accepted that it's unlikely to change. It doesn't bother me, though. She's unbearable, and it's no surprise she doesn't have a single friend. No one, except for our parents, can tolerate her for more than 6 months. That's the longest anyone, whether a friend or a boyfriend, has ever stuck around, and honestly, I don't blame them. For Grace, even 6 months is a record. She's so oblivious that she doesn't even realize she's the problem. She's spent her entire life believing she's flawless, and anyone who doesn't worship her is against her. According to her, she has the right to cut off anyone who fails to treat her like royalty. Well, too bad, the real world doesn't operate that way. Her entitlement stems from our parents' relentless enabling. They've placed her on such a pedestal that, at times, my younger sister, Kelsey, 14, and I feel like we were just afterthoughts, extras in a story that was only ever meant to revolve around Grace. But at least I have Kelsey. She means the world to me, and I desperately want her to escape this toxic household before our parents mold her into another version of Grace. They already encourage her to imitate Grace's behavior, but if that happens, she'll never be able to make anything of herself. She's too young to be turned into some kind of prop, and I won't let it happen. Thankfully, her personality is the complete opposite of Grace's. She's naturally grounded, and I'll do everything I can to shield her from the outdated, ridiculous beliefs that run in our family. Since childhood, I was repeatedly told that I was the man of the house, and that my destiny was to take over my father's business. I was drilled with the idea that being a man meant shouldering endless responsibilities, no room for fun, just working hard, earning money, and providing for the family. That's the way the men in my family lived, and for a long time, I didn't know there was any other way. The pressure to start making money came early. My father made it clear that he wouldn't just hand me opportunities. I had to prove myself first. Only if I demonstrated my worth as a man would he even consider helping me financially, like paying for college. I remember when I first got that lecture, I was just a kid, about to turn 11. I had asked if I could have a small birthday party with my friends, and instead of a simple yes or no, my dad sat me down and gave me a speech about growing up. He told me I was becoming a young man now, and it was time to stop being childish and start understanding responsibility. I wish I had ignored him, but back then, I didn't know any better. I got my first job when I was 13. It wasn't anything big, but I enjoyed it. I started by walking dogs for families in the neighborhood, and eventually, I moved on to dog sitting. I've always loved animals, and starting at such a young age helped me develop the skills, instincts, and most importantly, the patience needed for the job. It didn't pay much, but it gave me a steady income. I spent a little, but I saved most of it. My parents were proud of me, and in turn, that made me feel proud of myself. They never asked what I did with the money or how much I was making. Their only concern was making sure I wasn't spending it on anything dangerous like alcohol or drugs. They would even check my room regularly, but they never found anything, because I never had those habits. Instead, I stashed away my earnings, determined to save up for college. Back then, I was naive. I actually believed that the money I saved would be enough for school, which, in reality, it wasn't. More than that, I was certain my father wouldn't contribute a dime toward my education. He had already made it clear that the only way I would get financial help from him was if I proved myself worthy. The problem with being raised on this kind of mindset is that I never felt worthy of my father's money. I still don't. And this experience is the exact opposite of the life Grace has always known. She's never had to deal with any of these struggles. The only expectations placed on her were to look good and secure a wealthy husband. That's it. Those were the only two things she was ever taught to prioritize, and I assume that message was drilled into her from an early age. I say that because I can't recall a single time she tried to excel in school or take up hobbies that didn't revolve around makeup and fashion. I still remember something that happened when I was about 10. Our family was invited to my dad's friend's house, and Grace had a fever that day. She wasn't all dressed up like she usually was, and my parents were horrified. To them, a normal-looking Grace was somehow worse than a sick one. She asked to stay home since she wasn't feeling well, but they refused. They told her she had to come, assuring her we wouldn't stay long. Looking back, I think she might have had it rough in her own way, too. But instead of making her a better person, it just turned her into someone completely insufferable. Our parents have tried to do the same thing to Kelsey, pushing her into that same mold, but I'm doing everything I can to keep her from falling into it. Thankfully, with Grace's constant drama, our parents are so consumed with managing her chaos that they don't have much time to focus on us. This whole situation happened a few weeks ago, and I never expected it to escalate the way it did. I'm not complaining. I finally feel validated after all these years, but it's strange watching my family turn on each other like this. It all started when I got accepted into one of the top universities in my state for my undergraduate degree. I was incredibly proud of myself, especially since I earned a full scholarship, meaning money wouldn't be an issue. My parents were proud, too. Even my dad, who rarely gives compliments, told me he was proud of how hard I had worked. Hearing those words from him meant a lot. But then, what he said next completely blindsided me. Since I had a scholarship, he said, I could work to cover my living expenses. That stung. I had been working since I was 13, believing that if I proved myself responsible, my dad would step in to help when the time came. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could enjoy my late teens for once, after spending most of my adolescence juggling school and work. But no. He claimed he had been preparing me for the trials of life since I was a boy. What trials? My life could have been so much easier. I felt frustrated for a while, but I decided to confront him. At worst, he'd yell at me, but that didn't matter. I needed a break. I needed rest. I needed a life. So, I told him everything. I reminded him that I had been working since I was a kid, all because he had promised that if I showed responsibility with money, he would help me with college. I asked him what more I could have possibly done to prove my worth, and told him that I had given my best effort all these years. I was exhausted. I wanted to have a real college experience, and I asked him to help cover my living expenses. I had a decent amount saved up from years of working, but I knew it wouldn't be enough for everything. That's why I needed his support. He let out a long sigh and just looked defeated. Then he told me he understood where I was coming from, but there wasn't much he could do right now, because Grace was going through a lot. I snapped. I told him that Grace was always going through something, that he had always put her first. He had no problem spending thousands on her designer clothes and endless makeup. He paid for both of her weddings out of his own pocket. And for what? Just so her husbands could dump her because she had the personality of a cardboard cutout? She was nothing more than a brainless Barbie doll, and he still bent over backward for her. Dad just sighed, looking worn out. He said there was nothing he could do. She was in a bad place right now. A bad place? She had been divorced twice. Her first husband, Luke, was actually the son of one of Dad's friends. He was about 8 years older than her, and they got married when she was 20. By the time she was 21, the marriage was over. I never knew the details. I was young and, thankfully, kept out of it. But Dad and his friend are still on good terms, so I can only assume the blame didn't fall on Luke. Then, 2 years ago, Grace married again. This time, though, no one in the family liked the guy. His name was Andy, and he just oozed sleaze. I have no idea what Grace saw in him other than his money because, to be fair, he was loaded, but he was also weird and gross. Even my parents, who usually worship anyone with a fat bank account, couldn't stand him. Unsurprisingly, that marriage crashed and burned too. Andy was a serial cheater, and he knew exactly how to keep Grace quiet, money and luxury. She was so obsessed with the lifestyle that she put up with everything. My parents tried to get her to leave him, but she refused. She said she couldn't handle another failed marriage and would make it work no matter what. Well, making it work didn't last long. Andy ended up getting another woman pregnant and dumped Grace on the spot. So, she came crawling back home. That was a year ago, and ever since, our lives have been miserable, especially for Kelsey. Now that my parents have realized their golden project failed, that Grace couldn't live up to the expectations they had set for her, they've started eyeing Kelsey. They've been trying to mold her into the same image, but I've done everything in my power to stop it. I know their tactics. I know how they manipulate. And I've made sure Kelsey does too. I knew I had to act fast, Not just for myself, but for Kelsey too. I had no idea who to turn to. Talking to my uncles would be pointless. Sure, they'd sympathize, but even if they tried to reason with Dad, he'd just brush them off. And in the end, I'd be the one facing the consequences. The only people who could truly get through to my father, the only ones he actually listened to, were my grandparents. They were the only ones who had enough authority to shut this nonsense down. By this point, I didn't even care about Dad's money. I had already come to terms with the fact that I'd be funding my own way through college. Now, I wanted revenge. I wanted the world to see the truth, to expose what went on behind these closed doors and show everyone who my father really was. I had no idea that one phone call to my grandfather would change everything. If I had known just how much influence Grandpa had over Dad, I would have called him years ago to end this madness. I told Grandpa everything. I left nothing out. I told him how I had spent years working, not because I wanted to, but because I was desperately trying to prove my worth to my parents. Apparently, Mom and Dad had been telling everyone that I had insisted on working, that they had tried to stop me, but I refused to listen. That was a lie. I told Grandpa about my scholarship, about Dad's refusal to help me financially, and finally, I told him about Grace's ridiculous cosmetic surgery plans, ones that Dad expected me to pay for. It was a long, emotional call, and I had a feeling Grandpa didn't fully grasp everything over the phone. He told me to calm down and meet him in person to talk it through properly. So, the next day, I drove an hour to his house and laid it all out again. He didn't interrupt. He barely even reacted. When I finished, he just looked at me and asked, "What do you want?" I hesitated. I didn't know exactly what I wanted. I just knew I was done with the favoritism, the neglect, the blatant unfairness. Grandpa nodded and told me not to worry. He said he would handle everything. That was last week. So far, nothing has changed. Dad is still pressuring me to hand over my money. Now he's brought Mom into it, and she's pulling every trick in the book: emotional blackmail, guilt tripping, the whole act. But I'm not backing down. I know Grandpa is going to show up, and I know he's going to rip Dad apart. I trust him. But now, I just can't wait for it to happen. I need my vengeance. I need my justice. Update 1. Guys, the blow-up finally happened, and it was so much bigger, or better, than I ever expected. I never thought things would come full circle like this. But hey, I'm definitely not complaining. My grandparents showed up and gathered the whole family together. Dad assumed it was just one of those routine family lunches where we'd eat, chat, and go our separate ways. Oh, how wrong he was. It started with Grandpa casually asking Dad what his plans were for Grace. Mom muttered something under her breath, but Dad confidently stated that she was planning to enroll in college and they were still deciding on the best option for her. The problem? Everyone except Dad knew that was a blatant lie. But Grandpa wasn't in the mood for games. He turned straight to Grace and asked her directly which colleges and courses she was looking into. She just sat there, completely silent, staring blankly at everyone. Awkwardness filled the room. Dad's face turned bright red. Then, Grandpa turned to me and asked about my college plans. I told him I had secured a full scholarship, but that I had no financial help for living expenses. Grandpa shot Dad a look. Dad, brilliant actor that he is, pretended not to see it. And then Grandma stepped in. She didn't ask if Dad was giving me money. She asked how much. Dad stammered something about how we hadn't discussed it yet. And that's when I called him out. I told everyone, right then and there, that Dad and I had talked about it, and he had flat out refused to help me. Grace kicked me under the table. I ignored her. This was coming out. Dad gave a nervous, fake laugh and brushed it off as just some playful banter between father and son. Meanwhile, Mom was glaring daggers at me. If looks could kill, I'd already be 6 feet under. I wasn't done. I fired back, saying it didn't feel like banter to me, especially since Dad had also asked me to hand over all my savings to fund Grace's cosmetic surgeries. And that's when Grandpa slammed his hand on the table. He turned to Dad and asked if it was true. Dad, too caught off guard to even attempt a lie, immediately admitted it. Silence. The whole room went dead quiet. Grandpa, bless his heart, took his time scanning the faces of everyone in the room. He has a flair for theatrics, and this time, it worked beautifully. Then, he broke the silence. He asked Dad why. Dad had no answer. Then he turned to Mom and asked how she could possibly justify such blatant favoritism. She had nothing to say, and that's when Grandpa stood up and announced that, Since my parents were unwilling to do the right thing, he would be stepping in. He revealed that he had set aside a $300,000 inheritance for the three of us. His original plan was to split it evenly. But since Mom and Dad had chosen to pour all their money, attention, and effort into Grace, while neglecting Kelsey and me, he had decided to reconsider the division. So, instead of an equal split, he declared that Grace would receive $30,000. The remaining $270,000 would be divided equally between Kelsey and me. My jaw dropped. $135,000. That's an insane amount of money. I had never expected this. I had never even hinted to Grandpa that I wanted him to give me more, so I had no idea why he made this decision. But the moment he did, all hell broke loose. Grace immediately started screaming. She kept yelling about how she had no idea there was that much money set aside, and how it was so unfair that she was getting peanuts while Kelsey and I were walking away with a fortune. Grandpa, completely unfazed, shot back. Your entire life, you've been getting everything, while Kelsey and Opie got nothing. You didn't seem to think that was unfair back then. Dad tried to jump in, arguing that this was discrimination and that Grandpa was favoring some of his grandkids over others. Grandma shut that down instantly. She told him this wasn't discrimination, this was justice. Mom and Dad were the ones who started the favoritism, and Grandpa and Grandma were just correcting it. They were making sure the other two kids, the ones Mom and Dad treated like garbage, actually had a chance at life. She didn't hold back. She said none of this would have happened if Mom and Dad had just been decent parents and understood how a real family was supposed to work. Dad was desperate now. He insisted that Grace shouldn't be punished for a crime she didn't commit, so she should still get her fair share. And that's when Grandpa lost it. He was still trying to keep things civil, but I could tell that Dad's constant justifications, his refusal to apologize or take responsibility, had set Grandpa off. Then Grandpa did something that completely blindsided everyone in the room. He nodded and said, "You know what? You're right." For a split second, I actually saw Grace relax. She even sighed in relief. But Grandpa wasn't finished. He continued, "You're absolutely right. The real culprits here are you and your wife. Grace is just a product of your terrible parenting." Then he dropped the bombshell. Dad's inheritance? Gone. Instead, every single cent that was originally meant for Dad, and by extension, Grace, would now go directly to Kelsey and me. I watched as the color drained from Dad's face. He was shook. It was painfully obvious that he had not thought this through. But too bad for him, because Grandpa had. Dad tried to stammer out that Grandpa couldn't do that. Grandpa just smirked and said, "Watch me." It was legendary. I swear, that man earned my eternal respect in that moment. Then he stood up and said he had nothing more to add. Before leaving, he issued one final warning. Do not harass or manipulate Opie or Kelsey. They are not to blame for any of this. I have done what I believe is right, but if you come after them, trust me, I can go even lower. And just like that, he was gone. Dad, he hasn't spoken a word to us since. He's terrified. I know he is. He's scared Grandpa is actually going to follow through with everything he just said, and honestly, he should be. Kelsey is still too young to fully understand what just happened, but I can feel the tension in the air. Mama's been trying to talk to me, but I've been ignoring her, just like I did my entire childhood. And now, suddenly, I'm the star of the family. Everyone is sucking up to me. Even Grace. I told her to piss off. She is the last person I want to deal with right now. Honestly, I'm just relieved that Grandpa finally cut them off. Now, they're finally going to face the consequences of their actions. And as for me, I'm set for life. I don't have to worry about college. I don't have to stress about what comes next. For the first time in my life, I actually have a future. Update 2. Just a small update. I've officially left for college. Leaving home was bittersweet. Kelsey hugged me and cried. I cried too. I know things are going to be really tough for her now. My parents are definitely going to try and manipulate her. I told her to keep me updated on everything that happens at home, and she promised she would. I can only hope I can do enough to protect her, to keep her from getting brainwashed by the same people who raised me. Grandpa told me that I could use part of my inheritance for living expenses, and I'm so grateful to him. But I told him that I'd probably take up a job, because, for me, this was never about the money. It was about the neglect, the lack of acceptance, all the rage I felt. It was never about financial struggles. It was about them. Grandpa said he respected my decision. He told me that, In his eyes, I was more of a man than his own son. But he also reminded me that life will always be full of burdens and responsibilities, and he didn't want me to miss out on living because I felt obligated to prove something. So, we made a deal. I'll try working first, and if it ever becomes too much, I won't hesitate to dip into my inheritance, because, as he put it, that money is mine by right. We both got a little emotional after that. Honestly, I don't think I'll need the inheritance. I don't mind working. It just feels good to know that I have someone in my corner. For the first time in my life, I have real support, financially, yes, but more importantly, emotionally. And maybe that's what I've been missing all along. It's overwhelming, but in the best way possible.